Inside every human being, there's a battle waging between the forces of good or light and dark. And it's up to you to choose which side of the force you're going to give your power to. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Penny's Mind Files Method, the podcast showing you where the off ramp to the healing highway is when you are stuck on the life sucks road. Now, before we dive into the episode today, just a reminder that the episodes are going to be a little further apart, closer to 2 weeks, sometimes maybe even 3 weeks over the next little while, because I'm working on a big project for you guys, actually. And I can't. I'm a one-person team, so I can't do everything all at once. So if you haven't yet watched all the previous episodes, I really encourage you to do that because that will help you understand what we're talking about in these later episodes. Okay, on to this week's episode. So today we're talking about the internal battle between right and wrong, or good and evil, or light and dark. Or in the Mind Files method, we use the analogy of the filing cabinets, the love cabinet, and the fear cabinet. You see, it doesn't really matter if you're talking about ancient Greece or ancient Egypt or Norse mythology, where it's chaos versus order. It's all the same oppositional force story. And what makes these explanations seem different is the language used and how the presentation is given. But at the core, if you decode the imagery and the metaphors, it's ultimately the same story. So, why is that? Well, I don't know for sure, but I think it's because people have been trying to figure out people for forever. Why? Because people have been harming people for forever. I've said this before, but every generation thinks they're the only ones experiencing whatever it is they think that they're experiencing. And that's why they come up with these new and interesting words and phrases to describe the same things that people have been describing for thousands of years. Now, some of that is the need to be relevant or new, right? Which is ultimately a quest for validation and recognition. And those things are a consequence of academic conditioning. So the desire really skyrocketed when social media came into play and morphed into this need, intense need to be liked and followed. But the root of those desires, and really all the desires that are talked about all throughout history, are all fear based. They're tied to pride and the lower vibration of craving or longing. And when those needs aren't met, well, then anger seeps in, and then guilt for feeling angry, and then shame. And ultimately, you get trapped in this negative feedback loop of negative energy. Nowadays, there's two kinds of religions. One leans on scientific proof, the other leans on something that can't be found under a microscope. One is thousands of years old, although it's gone through a lot of transformations, but the core teachings have remained the same. And the other's only a few hundred years old, dating back to around 1590, when the compound microscope was invented, a little over 430 years ago. And that started what I call the age of the ego. When people began believing that they could prove everything that there is to proved and known in the whole universe. It launched the quest to explain creation, which is ultimately the quest to find a scientific explanation for God. And here's the important part of that train of thought: if you can explain it, then you become God. And so far, well, nobody's done that. Nobody's explained it. But they've been trying for 400 years. The ego, what we refer to as the mind's process in the Mind Files method, it's a strong force. It pulls you down into the world of vices and pleasures and greed. It's where you form attachments to things and narratives that describe wounds. It's where jealousy keeps you trapped in an us versus them mindset. I think it was Wayne Dyer who said ego stands for edging God out. And that's true. The ego doesn't want you forming a relationship with God because they're ultimately opposites, right? The ego lives in the lower half of the emotional filter frequency scale, whereas God, which is love and joy and enlightenment, well, that vibrates at the top. In ancient Greece, Plato, in a conversation with Phaedrus, described the soul as a charioteer driving two horses, one black and one white. In the Mind Files method, we interpret this metaphor through a modern lens. The charioteer represents consciousness, and the horses represent competing impulses. The black horse, of course, symbolizes reactive fear based force, and the white horse symbolizes love based force. The job of the charioteer is to find balance between these two horses and keep the chariot and even keeled and on a straight path. In psychological terms, this is integration. And this is very different from the moralized version of this story. It's an important distinction that we will explore later on. Hundreds of years later, that same story, Plato's story, morphed into two dogs and then later into two wolves. So the version that you've likely heard goes something like this. An elder is talking to his grandson, and he says, "Inside me and inside you, there is a battle between two wolves. One wolf is good. It represents love and kindness and humility, compassion, peace, generosity, and truth. And the other wolf is evil. It represents anger, envy, greed, resentment, arrogance, lies, and fear. These two wolves are always fighting." Then the grandson asks, "Well, grandfather, which wolf wins?" And the elder replies, "The one you feed." It's the same story, different animals. This version focuses, though, on the conscious choice of feeding either the light or the dark side. But the actual story, the one that everybody was taking from, whether they knew it or were aware of it or not, dates all the way back to ancient Egypt. Thoth, the god Thoth, was a mediator between good and evil. He kept the balance between light and dark. In this version, the forces are unseen and supernatural. Man is influenced by dualistic gods, four representing masculine and four representing feminine energies. Now, not literal gender necessarily, these are energetic forces. Masculine energy is active, whereas feminine energy is more receptive. And if you dig into each god's temperament, you'll find that they fall into dualistic categories of light and dark or love and fear. The mind's process is drawn to dark energy because it's in the darkness where shame and guilt and apathy and fear all reside. All the emotional energies that are on the lower half of the emotional filter frequency scale. This is where the narratives describing all your painful experiences are stored because the lower half is where the fear cabinet is. Alternatively, love and joy and enlightenment, energies associated with God or the all or the universe, depending on which name you want to use for that force, they all vibrate on the top half or the upper half of the EFFS. So the upper half is where willingness and acceptance and reason also live. And it's where all the files describing your achievements and your inspirations and your revelations, it's where all of those are housed. So the big question here is, do you really choose between the two halves? So if people are the cause of your emotional wounds, and clearly they are because people say and do incredibly cruel things to one another, and if it's true that you can't control what others say and do to you, and if it's true that you didn't choose to be harmed, and if it's true that the stories recalling those experiences are stored in the fear cabinet, well, then how could any of that be your choice? Well, it isn't, because you can't control what others say or do. So, this is where that familiar saying, I'm sure you've heard it. It says, you cannot control the behavior of others, but you can always choose how you will respond to it. Well, that's where this comes in. But there's a catch to this, because if you haven't resolved the files that deal with your wounds, you can't control how you're going to react, because you're going to react based on the emotional filters attached to your dominant fear files. That's what a trigger is. It's a involuntary reaction. So let's review the mind's process so you get a better understanding of how this all works. And if you're new to the Mind Files Method podcast, then this is going to be especially important for you. If we dig deeper into the actual process and look at it strictly, let's say from a psychological perspective, the brain behaves like a computer writing code. It generates stories automatically, and every time those stories are replayed, the neural pathways that support them grow stronger. It's a mechanical process. It happens without conscious intention. And many people prefer this explanation because it appears to remove responsibility or choice. But that's only half of the scientific picture. Consciousness, the part that is aware, the part science acknowledges but can't yet define, observes the brain's activity. It can notice your thoughts, can interrupt impulses, and redirect your attention. This is where choice enters the system. But even here, the explanation remains rooted in brain function. It describes the mechanics of awareness, but it leaves out something essential: the heart, the felt sense of meaning, value, and inner alignment that guides why you choose one pathway over another. Now, in contrast, the purely spiritual, new agey spiritual explanation skips the mechanism entirely. It goes straight to the heart, straight to intuition and compassion and feeding the good wolf, but it ignores the reality of how the brain actually works. It overlooks conditioning and trauma and automatic impulses and the fact that the brain will continue writing stories whether you want it to or not. In other words, it describes the ideal without acknowledging the process. It took me a long time to figure out how to integrate both systems, because the reality is, if you don't figure that out, you're not going to heal. And I don't know about you, but I was tired of reliving the same shit in a different pile. I wanted out of that negative feedback loop that was keeping me stuck there. I tried the psychology path and it helped, but I didn't heal. Then I tried the new agey spiritual path and I didn't heal there either. So I wasted a lot of years of good living traveling down those paths. But I mean, the good news is that I eventually came to kind of a crossroad, and it was there where I could finally put all the pieces together from both paths. And then I found real healing. And that's why I created the Mind Files method, so that you can heal from whatever wounded you as well. So here's what I hope you walk away from this episode with today, is understanding that there really is a battle between love and fear going on in you. It's not a myth and it's not a metaphor and it's not an ancient story from ancient civilizations. It's actually happening in you right now. Not because you're broken or weak, and not because you should be over whatever it is that hurt you or harmed you by now. It's happening because A, you haven't had a clear guide of how to work through all of it. And you're human, right? You've lived, and because you've lived, you've gotten hurt. Now your brain wrote stories to protect you. We have to get away from that protection. Integrate your brain and your heart. So the Mind Files method exists to help you bridge those worlds, the psychological, the spiritual, the emotional, the neurological, so that you can finally stop reacting from fear and start choosing from a place of love. You don't win the battle by feeding the good wolf. You win the battle by healing the wounded one. And when you do that, the chariot finally moves forward. The horses finally get in balance, the filing cabinets align, and you finally become the person that you were always meant to be. Thanks for listening, and remember, the off-ramp's always there. You just have to choose to take it. If this episode resonated with you, please hit that thumbs up so that others looking for explanations about life, how to navigate life, can find this podcast. And get in the conversation. Tell me what you think. Leave a comment or reach out to me on social media. The links are all in the description, and we'll see you next time.